Okay, so thank you for being here, Alex. You're a postdoc with us, funded by the Society for Applied Philosophy. And can you tell us a bit about the work you've been up to as part of your postdoc and what you hope to keep doing in the future?
Yes, I've been working on various things this year. So one thing I've been working on a lot is the ethics of deepfakes. So a lot of this came out of the scandal we saw earlier this year with Grok, where it was generating these horrible images of women and in some cases children. And I've been working on the ethical impact of these images. So part of my PhD was on virtual reality, and there are similar harms there where things that people know that aren't real can be really distressing to see that kind of content. And similar harms are occurring for deepfakes. So I've been looking at how this impacts people and some of how people can kind of respond to this, in some cases, trauma that these images cause.
Okay, so would it be fair to say that like what distinguishes your approach is that your primary focus is the harms, not necessarily the epistemology? And so this question of kind of like whether we know they're real or not, how we know and under what conditions we know is sort of less relevant. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a lot of kind of misconceptions around these deepfakes, where a lot of people were responding to the scandal by saying things like, oh, they're not real, they're fictional, they're fake, and as if that should diminish the harm that they cause. But that's obviously not the case. I mean, even when people know these images are real, they still have a really significant impact. So a lot of the time when we think about deepfakes, we think about how they might deceive people. But in this case, that's just besides the point. People aren't deceived by these sexual images, but they still harm them.
Okay, and like, when we're thinking about the kind of state of mind of someone engaging with this material, you say that they're sort of not deceived, sort of in some sense they know that they're not real. Is that the same as the way we know interacting with, somebody in person is real, or is there some other kind of state of mind here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a similar kind of thing going on where we know that something's not the case, but often the way that it appears can still affect us psychologically in ways as if it were. So I think this can happen when we interact with people, for example, on dating apps where things kind of seem a bit too good to be true, but we still kind of go along with things nonetheless. And I think it's the same kind of thing where we can have these kind of underlying doubts, or we can know that things aren't as they seem. But this is how a lot of scams work, right? Is they get us to look past these kind of doubts we have, even when we know the thing maybe is too good to be true. We still end up giving our money away.
Yeah, and would you say there are parallels with kind of philosophical research into fiction and sort of aesthetic matters, right? Where our engagement with fiction, whether literary fiction or, film, does involve, some awareness that what we're seeing may not be real, but we can't fully disengage emotionally from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is really true of virtual reality, especially. So a lot of my PhD was looking at how work in the philosophy of fiction can be applied to the case of virtual reality, and how similar notions of immersion appear there, and how people emotionally respond to things that, even when they know they're real, they can be really impactful. So think about, reading a great book or engaging with virtual reality. We emotionally respond really strongly, even though we know the stuff's not real. So there's a common thread through that in kind of work in philosophy of fiction and imagination, and applying that to kind of new technologies that do the same kinds of things.
So would that mean then that sort of the way we need to start thinking about deepfakes has to kind of join up with the way we're starting to kind of grapple with AI companions and AI entities where, this may not be a representation of a kind of real person, but nonetheless people are engaging with it with a slimmer kind of immersion, to use your phrase?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right for AI companions. I think they very much feed off this kind of immersed form of engagement where we almost don't really care that the chatbot isn't real. It's not a real person. It doesn't matter. The reality kind of goes out the window, and I think it's exactly the same for these deepfake images. Whether they're real or not, they still have the same emotional impact, and for chatbots, they have the same emotional appeal. They can, offer a sense of intimacy, offer us someone to confide in, even if they're not a real someone at all.
So is the thought then that sort of like the philosophical mistake is to think the question of reality is sort of having a grip in a kind of practical, ethical sense, whereas actually that's a kind of subsidiary question, almost a kind of theoretical question, which people, when they're engaging with whether it's a deepfake or AI companion, they're not really engaging with that issue at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as philosophers, we're very interested in kind of what people believe, what they know. These are classic questions in epistemology. But a lot of research in psychology says that our kind of considered judgments in these cases don't make as big a difference as we might think. What we know, what we believe, doesn't matter so much for how we respond to media, especially these types of media where they're really realistic. So realistic deepfake media, imaginary or AI companions that behave exactly like a real person would. It doesn't matter what our beliefs are, it's how we engage with it. And that's the same whether it's real or not.
Okay. So then can you maybe say a little bit more about where you think the harms lie then? So, I mean, let's just focus on deepfakes for the sake of argument. We've kind of put this question of reality to one side, and sorry to the epistemologists out there. And so now the question is kind of like, what are the harms? I mean, is there a central core harm, or is it a kind of family of harms?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of ways in which these deepfake images, especially sexual deepfake images, harm people. I mean, first, there's an obvious psychological harm. We're seeing reports of people experiencing symptoms of PTSD following seeing images and deepfake videos of themselves doing things that they never did. So even though they know that the content wasn't real, they're still having flashbacks to things depicted in deepfake videos. So there's a clear kind of psychological harm. But there's also a more kind of representational harm of what these images do, how they function, and how they kind of objectify, sexualize, humiliate, they exercise control over how people present themselves. You posted an innocent image 7 years ago and now everyone's bombarding you with sexualized versions of it. Even aside from the psychological impact, that impacts how you present yourself online. And these days we care very much about how we appear online, and this exerts a kind of control over how we're able to do this.
Okay. So does your research touch on sort of like the practical and policy dimensions of this, like having identified some of the core harms? I mean, an obvious question people are going to want to confront is sort of, can we address these harms? Like, is there an obvious way of doing that? I mean, control is really interesting. Is the answer to give people more control, give them back control? Like, what do you think we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, so, I mean, the policy landscape on this is honestly a mess. There's been a kind of whack-a-mole type approach where over the past 5 or 10 years, different digital image-based or digital representational harms have emerged with things like upskirting images, revenge porn, deepfake AI images. And each time a kind of small piece of legislation or an amendment is tucked into some bill that's passing through Parliament that criminalises that specific thing and goes no further. And so something else pops up 2 months later, and it's just this whack-a-mole approach where we're always being very reactive. So one thing that I think is really interesting is that some legal scholars and philosophers are interested in more proactive approaches. So having a kind of proposal for a law that would cover a lot of these different cases that are exploiting the same kind of representational harm. So having a more wide-ranging offence rather than each time something comes up, we criminalise this particular thing and this particular thing, and then something else happens.
I mean, could you tell me what the content of such a piece of legislation should be? I mean, I guess the worry here is that it's going to be really challenging to pin down and avoid these particular harms without being overextensive. I mean, I was immediately thinking, sort of definitionally working out what kind of constitutes a deepfake sounds quite challenging. I mean, I can imagine that writers of fiction, cartoonists, people whose job it is to sort of depict people in ways that they may not want to be depicted, might be worried here that like kind of their work will fall foul of this legislation. So can we say more? And I guess one thing that listeners might want to know is whether the issue is the kind of fictionalized representation of someone doing something that they haven't done, or whether it's the kind of sexualized nature of those representations.
Yeah, so at the moment, a lot of the laws have just been about sexual representations. I mean, we've seen, even in recent weeks, there have been a few kind of more political cases that don't involve sexual content, but typically those aren't illegal. There have been some calls to make them illegal. One of the interesting proposals that's happened, and this comes from a legal professor at Durham, Claire McGlynn, is that she's proposed this new offence of intimate intrusions. And this resuscitates a kind of old feminist idea from the 1970s and 80s, that we might introduce a new offence that's covering a lot of these types of cases, all of which fall under a similar type of intimate intrusion. So kind of exerting control and sexualizing someone's digital representation. These are all types of intrusion into someone's intimacy. But some of the opposition to some of this legislation has come exactly from the source you say. So some of the laws around banning sexualized deepfakes have actually faced opposition in Parliament from people claiming, oh, this would criminalize making cartoons. And so I think there's exactly this trade-off you're saying between a kind of free speech ability to satirize on the one hand, and then obviously we want to criminalize a lot of these horrific images and some of this kind of satirical content. The worry is that laws banning deepfake AI will kind of go too far and criminalize some other content that we don't want to do so for.
I mean, just picking up on a kind of thread in what you're saying and circling back to this issue of control. So it sounds to me like you're sort of saying, and with this idea of intrusion on the table as well, that the issue here is that when someone puts an image of themselves into a public domain and that image is then subsequently used as a kind of springboard for something else, it's that kind of move which is problematic. And I'm wondering, is that the case, or would you think that these problems exist with images which have been generated from other source material? So maybe the person concerned hasn't put an image of themselves, maybe the image exists, from an organizational photograph, or someone just uses a photograph they have themselves to do it, right? Like, how much of it is about worrying about the extent to which the things that we put out there are kind of misappropriated, as opposed to just the representation of someone in general?
Yeah, so I largely think that it doesn't matter whether it's something that the individual has put out or whether it's kind of created from scratch, so to speak. I think there are really interesting conversations around how this compares to other laws we have around things like libel and defamation, where we do have a clear right not to be represented in certain ways, right? If someone represents me in a way that defames me, then that's illegal. Whereas if someone does that with a picture showing me in a sexual position that I was never in, then that's not illegal. So there's a question of whether we should just be extending some of these existing ideas that we're very happy with for language to the case of images. Okay,
that's interesting. So is part of the problem here that we just don't have a kind of adequate way of thinking about representation, right? So we're kind of comfortable with certain forms of representation. Obviously, I suppose a hangover from the time when print media was the main source of media, to this kind of fast-paced digital image-based context where images are representing people. Is that part of the problem? We just need to think more generally, like, what is it to represent someone, what is it to misrepresent them, and kind of take it from there.
Yeah, I think part of what's happened, we were always able to do this kind of thing. We were always able to draw pictures of someone, making them appear a way that they actually aren't. But what's really changed is the way in which these can now be generated really realistically through AI. And so this is an old problem that's just become much more pressing. And yeah, I think an extension of how we think about language, which has always been very kind of malleable. We've always been able to do this with language so easily. We're now able to do that in the same way with images. And the idea might be, well, maybe we should start to think about images similar to how we have thought about language in this sense.
So can I also ask you about some other work that I know you've done? So looking at kind of deepfakes, the way they're circulating on social media is one thing, but you've also been looking at other kinds of arenas in which we represent ourselves. And I think you mentioned dating apps already, right? So can you say a little bit more about your work in that area and what you hope to be doing in the future as well?
Yeah, so one thing that I've been really interested in some of my past work has been looking at how we role play as a character in cases like video games and virtual reality, and thinking about whether similar ideas might apply to certain online contexts, where similarly we present ourselves a certain way. And in some cases, this can be very authentic, and on social media, we're exactly the same as how we are in person. But in other cases, obviously, there's quite a big discrepancy. And this is obviously a massive problem on dating apps with catfishing and people presenting themselves, even subtly, in ways that aren't how they really are when you meet them in person. So I'm interested in kind of what counts as representing yourself authentically, as well as what the ethical side of this is. What's unethical? Do you always have to present yourself authentically? Is it okay to conceal certain information on dating apps to kind of protect yourself in certain ways?
And what are the kind of moral concepts in play here? So like the thing that immediately jumps to mind for me would be consent, and obviously we have a literature exploring this question about what people have a right to know in order to give consent to things, right? So people might say, look, I would have never gone on a date with this person if I'd known so and so fact about them, and these are often called deal breakers, and that's sort of the consent direction. Is that something you're touching in, and are there other moral kind of worries we should be having about sort of representation, misrepresentation, inauthenticity, and the whole kind of smorgasbord of kind of possible issues there?
Yeah, In terms of consent, I think that's absolutely a really applicable notion, but a lot of the attention to consent typically focuses on consent to sex. And within the philosophical literature, that's the massive focus. Everyone's very interested in what counts as giving consent to sex, what types of information might vitiate someone's consent. So if I don't tell someone that I have this property, might that vitiate their consent? And there have been a bunch of really interesting legal cases on this as well. Whereas what I'm thinking about is, as you say, thinking about more general kind of consent to romantic relationships, or even just, going on a date. What kind of information is impermissible to do so there? And it's this classic kind of conflict between privacy of someone on the other hand, and the other person's right to know certain information. I mean, romance is a sphere where intimacy is meant to be a goal. We're meant to have mutual knowledge of our partner and know all this information. I mean, some philosophers even say that love requires seeing one's partner accurately. And so there seems like a domain where our ethical obligations for disclosing certain information might be heightened more than others. And that's why I think this is a really interesting field.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I guess there's also this question about timing, right? So a critic will say to you, look, the reason that we kind of focus on consent to sex is that that's often something that happens a bit later on after people have met. And that's not always the case. But we might think that going on a date, beginning a series of dates with someone might be chosen by this person as a kind of way of informing them of an important piece of information, right? So we could have a kind of well-intentioned dater who thinks, look, I know there's this piece of information about me that's contentious or that somebody might want to know, but instead of sort of slapping it on my dating profile, I'll use the date itself as a kind of way of talking that through. And maybe they have good reasons for that, right? Maybe historically they've been overlooked or neglected. There's a justice issue here, for example. Maybe it's about their religion or their ethnic background, their history or something. They're subject to prejudice. So how would we kind of approach that? Do we think that kind of there are certain things that people ought to know before they go on a date, and then sort of some other things that maybe they ought to know before they engage in sex with somebody? Do we have a kind of unified picture between these different cases? Like, how do we even begin to answer this question?
Yeah, I think these are really hard cases, and there are a lot of kind of contentious properties, as you said. Religion, gender identity might be another really contentious issue, where it's unclear whether this is something that you have to disclose at the outset, maybe after a few dates, probably prior to sex. And we've seen various legal cases around this in the UK recently. So I think, there's this really tricky question of at what point you ought to disclose this information. And some things might be, there are lots of strong views on this, that some things you ought to disclose just at the outset. But as you say, there's all these justice issues where people who have experienced discrimination from disclosing this information might well wish to conceal certain aspects and maybe only reveal them later. I mean, within a romantic relationship, we often think about this kind of mutual knowledge as the goal, but I think a really interesting question is whether there's certain information that we might permissibly conceal from even a really committed romantic partner due to protect ourselves, essentially.
Yeah, so we have these kind of questions about the nature and value of privacy. I mean, that's also a kind of question that really kind of connects with this broader digital landscape that many of us are kind of swimming in, where we're seeing a kind of social expectation of kind of disclosure, revelation, kind of production of knowledge, whereas actually for many people privacy is vitally important to the kind of production of the self and of the identity. And so there is that key tension. I'm also kind of thinking around sort of ideas of conversation and ideas of sort of interaction. And I guess a lot of people might think, look, the reason I don't put things on my dating profile is firstly, no one reads it. But secondly, if they do, they lack context, right? And context is really important when it comes to certain potential deal breakers, right? Where we're often quick to judge, or the context really kind of supplies a background, right? So I don't know, someone might have been arrested and maybe it really matters to them that they tell a potential partner about this because the context is actually, well, I was arrested at a certain protest, protesting a certain policy, which I feel strongly about, which may make that arrest look very different from someone else's arrest. And so I guess this kind of raises this question, like, what role do you see for sort of dating as a kind of practice where people are kind of figuring each other out, coming to know each other? Is it a practice that sort of leaves room for these ambiguities and for people to kind of think about finding the right context, providing context, or do you think people should be a little bit more upfront with these pieces of information?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I mean, like all technology, it imposes various constraints on how we're able to do these things. So we have limited space in a dating app profile to even disclose this information. And as you say, it may well be the kind of subject that requires a lot of nuance that we just simply can't do, even in a online conversation. It might require a in-person conversation for some of these issues. So yeah, I think we definitely would not want to kind of push people towards simply disclosing a kind of laundry list of features about themselves, potential deal breakers. And I think this is one common complaint that people have about online dating, is that it reduces down to this kind of laundry list approach where we're saying, I have these preferences, kind of tick boxes, this person is this, I won't date someone who's this. And as you say, romance potentially has much more scope for this kind of conversational approach and negotiation, where we get to know one another and we have this context of why certain properties, which we might have thought we're very opposed to, might actually be, well, actually, given the context, it's maybe not so bad, or there's some reasons behind that we can come to terms with, in a way that a lot of these dating app platforms and profiles especially just don't allow this kind of nuance.
So, I mean, authenticity is a concept that's running through a lot of your work. In fact, it kind of connects both of these strands of deepfakes and sort of online dating and other things. Do you have a view about what authenticity is? I mean, I know that, there's lots of disagreements philosophically about what it is, and people don't really know how to sort of think about this, but do you have a view that you think is plausible?
Yeah, so I mean, roughly, so my background is in aesthetics, and I think a lot of work in the philosophy of art can be really helpful for thinking about authenticity. So lots of people are very interested in what makes a representation of something authentic. So say you see a painting. It can be an authentic representation in terms of representing the place accurately. It can be an authentic painting in terms of kind of representing the artist's kind of emotions, in a sense. There's all kinds of, it can be inauthentic in that it could be a forgery. So there's all kinds of things we can mean when we say that something's authentic. But I think largely we mean this kind of, in dating, this kind of fidelity, accuracy of representation. And so what we're talking about here is kind of representing the person's properties and not leaving important things out. So not omitting to mention certain things. So a profile of someone that fails to mention something that's really important, even if it contains no lies, can still obviously be inauthentic through omission. So I think this notion of authenticity as fidelity is really how I tend to think about it. And that's how people think about it in certain artistic contexts as well.
So kind of maybe a kind of final question on this then. So what role do you see in the future for technology on this subject? Because we seem to have a kind of tension. On the one hand, we're worrying about the ability of generative AI to produce kind of realistic seeming deepfakes, right? On the other hand, though, we might think one of the things that's missing in something like online dating is precisely it's really hard to get a feel for what someone's like, that a photograph isn't really adequate. It doesn't give a sense of someone's kind of character, how they appear, their charm, their sort of way of engaging. And I have heard it suggested by Paula Sweeney, for example, philosopher in Scotland, that actually using generative AI to kind of produce sort of digital avatars of ourselves can help with authenticity of representation when it comes to us, right? We want people to sort of engage with us as we are. We want to kind of get a better feel for other people as they are. And a way of bridging that gap in the digital space is to create and sort of circulate sort of verified or sort of secure representations of ourselves that allow people to get that sense, whether that's in virtual reality or through some kind of video or something like that, which is a view that I found really interesting when I heard it. I mean, my intuitive thoughts here with this is very bad, but I'm curious what you think, right? So it seems that technology is a kind of blunt instrument. We can use it in either way, but do you think there are kind of positive or kind of agency enhancing ways that we could use this stuff, or should we just steer clear altogether?
Yeah, I mean, there's a massive precedent for this. So in work on video games, so many people have met their partners through online message boards originally, and then kind of role-playing games. I mean, marriages through World of Warcraft and this kind of thing. This is an old idea, that people meet each other through kind of avatars that maybe they feel express them in certain ways better than kind of just messaging someone would, or even maybe better than meeting in person. People feel more comfortable kind of having this conversation mediated through avatars. So this is an old idea, and I think it's very natural to think about whether dating apps might be wanting to employ this same idea that has such precedent. Yeah, I mean, obviously there are worries around this, around like it kind of outsourcing our identity to a kind of avatar in these ways, and especially when it's, as is it is in some cases, an avatar that we don't directly control, but which we kind of shape, a kind of digital twin that acts on our behalf, as opposed to us directly controlling it. But yeah, this is an old idea, and I think this is very interesting as a possibility for allowing us to express ourselves. I mean, marginalized groups for years have been expressing themselves much more, they feel they can express themselves much more authentically through digital avatars in digital spaces, where in some cases they don't face the kind of persecution that they would in physical spaces. And so I think these kinds of ideas would be really helpful in certain communities.
Okay, well, it's clear that sort of however things go, there's a lot of kind of morally contentious territory to navigate, right? So I want to say thank you so much for talking to us about your work. It sounds really fascinating, and I hope the rest of the project goes well.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you for having me.